Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon session on the diffusion of AI and the new survey of AI in firms. My name is Alistair Nolan. I'm a senior policy analyst at the OECD, working in the OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. And I have particular responsibility at the moment for the design of a new survey, which I'll talk about in one moment. But we have a really stellar panel here. We're delighted and honored to have them as your discussants today. And I would like them just to introduce themselves, maybe in 1 minute, 90 seconds each. So I'll begin with Cecilia Worrell.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Cecilia Worrell. I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden. My basis is the Swedish Association for Engineering Industry. We organize 4,200 companies, many of them global brands, which you've heard about: Scania, ABB, Ericsson, the auto industry, Volvo, and the likes, but also their value chains and a lot of IT integrators. I specialize in advanced manufacturing. I work with research, policy development. I also lead a Swedish innovation program directed especially towards the manufacturing industry, and this is called Production 2030. And Production 2030 is a 12-year-long program funded by the Swedish innovation agency, Vinnova. And we also have counterparts all over Europe, which is very positive and very interesting. So anywhere in Europe, I have friends and colleagues who work with Industry 4 or similar programs, such as myself. Nice to be here today.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Benoit, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Alistair. Very nice to be here. My name is Benoit Bergeret. It's okay to call me Ben. I'm the managing director for the ESSEC Meta Lab for Data, Technology and Society. ESSEC is one of the leading business schools in France and abroad. And I focus on moving this institution towards a better integration of societal and other impact issues of the adoption of AI and data technologies, both in the education programs, in the research with our researchers, and also activate the public conversation about the impact of the adoption of AI. I have a 30+ year track record in AI. I'm a practitioner of AI. I've worked for large firms, set up AI labs. I'm a multiple-time AI startup entrepreneur. And I hope my perspective, which is mostly rooted in the field, in experience, practical experience, will be useful to the audience today.
Thank you, Benoit. Let me ask Pekka to.
Good afternoon. This is my name is Pekka Ala-Pietilä. I am joining in a capacity, I believe, of former chairman of high-level expert group on AI, EU Commission's initiative, which comprised of 52 experts, and we worked 2018 to 2020, formulating the ethical guidelines for AI, and as well the policy and investment recommendations for Commission. Prior to that, I was chairing a work for Finnish government on the AI strategy, and at the moment I'm doing also a work for Finnish government on sustainable growth, where the innovation and in that sense AI is in a key role. I'm also chairing publicly listed companies, and prior to these capacities I was working for a number of years in Nokia, heading the Nokia mobile phones in 1990s, and I stepped down as a president in 2005.
Sorry, Julian, please.
Hello, thank you, Alistair. I'm Julian David. I'm the CEO of Tech UK. We are the trade association for digital technology companies in the UK. We have 850 member companies, more than, in the UK. They range from very small companies to the largest tech international companies that you would recognize. And we focus on the application of technology, the positive outcomes of technology across the economy, society, and the planet. And among those things, we pride ourselves on being chips to clicks. So we have both the originators of the core silicon and chip design of technology, plus the people born on the internet. I'm also vice president for national trade associations at a European-wide organization called Digital Europe, which brings together over 30 trade associations from across the EU and beyond in Europe.
Thank you very much, Julian. So let me say a few words very briefly about the backdrop, the background to this session. And I'll introduce a new survey that the OECD is developing right now, with support from the AI WIPS program and in conjunction with INSEAD Business School and the Boston Consulting Group. And this is a new exploratory survey of AI in enterprises. We've been consulting actively with a broad variety of public, private and academic partners to develop this survey. Now, the survey aims to add insights to the existing survey work of national statistics offices and other bodies. We've included a number of questions in this survey which are novel, so they're addressing topics not treated in previous surveys, such as, for example, enterprises' stated priorities on a range of public policies. Other questions in the survey seek information on topics which are familiar, such as enterprises' use of cloud computing, but these questions give new emphases, for example, asking why cloud computing might be underutilized. This survey will provide the first set of standardized data on AI diffusion across G7 countries, plus Brazil. And we're focusing on two sectors, namely manufacturing and two subsectors of ICT. The focus on manufacturing is because this sector is a priority for many OECD and non-OECD governments. Indeed, over 30 countries now have developed national Industry 4.0 strategies, and manufacturing has grown as a theme in national research and innovation programs. In addition, the uses of AI in manufacturing are many, and the potential for new applications is large. Currently, we're doing cognitive testing of the survey questions, and we aim to put the survey into the field in a few months from now. So together with the survey itself, we're also going to begin case studies with large manufacturers, as well as interviews with national agencies that are responsible for accelerating the uptake of digital technology in manufacturing, in part to assess how the services provided by these agencies are being tailored, if at all, to the specific needs of AI adopters. A longer-term goal is that following the cognitive testing of the questions and the survey results, some of these questions might be incorporated into subsequent survey work performed by the national statistics organizations and other bodies. So that's the background to this session, and our speakers will help us generate further insight into the whole issue of diffusion. So let me go first then and perhaps address this first question to Cecilia. And so the question is, despite considerable hype around the use of AI in manufacturing and other parts of business, we see the diffusion rates are actually very low. A range of surveys with large sample sizes conducted by national statistics offices put this from anywhere from 2 to 14%. So from your experience, what would you attribute this to, perhaps with a particular focus on manufacturing?
Yes, thank you. It's an excellent question, and there's, I think, an answer on several levels. I will start off with the sort of the boring answer, which is the lack of time, money, and scalability. And in the manufacturing sector, it's typically there's a pattern of discrete manufacturing, which means you have machines alongside machines, and they're all separate from each other. And the interoperability rate is not what it should be in many companies. So data from each source is quite small, and it's not probably as clean and lean as it's supposed to be. So this is a problem that's in real life. Also, I know, since I have a lot of dialogue with SMEs especially, but also the larger manufacturing companies in Sweden, it's very difficult to identify applications at the right level. Even though we know that AI is an excellent tool for quality control, for example, or maintenance, it's very hard to find the right level to apply, get the data out and analyze it in the right way. And I talked with an AI consultancy this morning, a Swedish company, and they had really used about 3 years of their time to identify the shop floor level of AI. It took them a long time to find the right application level. So that is back to the time and money issue. It's very hard to find the right applications. Once you do, you can scale them. So that's a positive thing.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Benoit, I know you have experience, particularly as you mentioned, around industrial SMEs and AI. Perhaps you could give us your view.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alistair. First, let me say that I fully concur with what Cecilia just said. The fragmentation of core business processes in manufacturing is an issue that goes beyond the identification of the right solution. It's an issue that also brings in the culture of the leadership if we're talking about small and medium businesses, which is extremely different for many reasons from the leadership in large corporations. In small companies, they have less capital available to invest. They manage on very short cycle profitability of the project. And their daily worry is not so much about investing in fancy technology, but rather avoiding the traps of production issues and things like that. That said, there's another issue, I think, which is key beyond, for those who are convinced that they should be adopting AI, they just can't find the right skills because the right skills are available when you are applying AI to a data process. And these processes typically in these companies are found in the CRM, maybe in the supply chain to a certain extent areas, but not so much in the core manufacturing processes that, as Cecilia pointed out, need to be equipped, instrumented to provide the right amount of data and the skills to understand both what needs to be done, understands the core process, and understand the instrumentation, the data harvesting part of it, are very difficult to find. Most digital services company, IT companies around there, especially outside of the large industrial centers, are equipped with people who are great but very junior skills in AI. Whereas I've seen from experience that what's really needed by these companies is extremely deep AI so that they can provide deep value. Problem with people with deep AI experience is there's few of them and they are being absolutely attracted to the compensations and lifestyle of large companies from GAFAs to others. So that leaves a real gap for competitive skilling of small and medium businesses in Europe. It's a key issue. The last point I would like to make is lots of people talk about AI startups as being the solution. Well, in the industrial sector, I think that doesn't work. We've seen lots of startups trying to address predictive maintenance because that seems to be a topic that is horizontal enough across manufacturing. But very few of these topics are horizontal enough for a startup to be able to develop their business. Startups are constrained by their business model, which is constrained by the type of financing they raise. And so I think the key and the mistake that people should not be making is to think that startups, as in product startups, are the solution. They are not. The solution is services startups equipped with deep skills and going after one project after the other on a small scale, which in turn asks the questions of the business model for these people because of who they are talking to. And I think that calls for a very innovative and creative way to redefine the relationship specifically in the field of AI because of the characteristics of AI projects, including public financing, and maybe we'll talk about that later, that should, in my view, get down to a level of detail that usually public financing is not. It's not easy for public financing to be set up at that level of granularity.
Thank you very much, Benoit. There's a whole number of issues you've raised there, which are not often raised in discussions of the diffusion challenge. Perhaps going from the small to the very large, Pekka has experience right at the top of Nokia and with other companies. Pekka, perhaps you could give us your thoughts.
I think that probably the most fundamental question revolves around the mentality. So do we see AI and AI-related matters as an investment? And I think we should, because this paradigm shift is changing a number of things, having fundamental impact not only on AI, but also the digital infrastructure companies need to have and master and build, and also the data structures and lakes. So when you think the enabling elements, you almost need to have a triangle, and you could call it socio-technical infrastructure, where in order to be in a position to use AI, you need to have the needed digital infrastructure. It was cloud computing and it's still cloud computing, but if we look at the industrial applications, now we are very swiftly moving to the edge computing and edge sensoring and applications on AI, IoT, where the very, very low latency is needed. It demands completely different infrastructure, and that is an investment. And then getting the data cleaned and purified to the states where it can be applied. Again, it needs a major investments, but it's also investment of time and attention, because AI is always context specific. Every company, and within the company, every AI opportunity has its own context, business context, and you need to understand that in order to be in a position then to design the algorithms and then the data design elements so that you can take advantage. But if the piloting is relatively easy, you can, if you have the interest and the curiosity, you need three persons. You need the one who understands the business, the one who understands the data engineering, and the one who understands the data science, and they can pull together the piloting, and that is cheap. You can do it fast, but in order to really gain the momentum and the benefits, you need to rethink number of things, not only the infrastructure data, but many times also the processes within the company. And that process redesign according to the AI and data flows is requiring change management. And that's probably the hardest part of the scaling when we look years down the road, how these gradually increasing benefits can be extracted from AI.
Thank you very much, Pekka. And there's a couple of points which you've raised there, which would lead me to ask some questions, which I'll come back to in a moment. But Julian has another perspective, a complementary perspective in trying to help companies adopt AI. So Julian, perhaps you can give us your thoughts, and feel free to comment on what's already been said, please.
Thank you. Well, I would echo pretty much all of the comments so far. Maybe just pick up on a couple of points. First of all, the skills point, and Pekka did sort of allude to this. One of the biggest challenges is people inside the business that actually know how to adopt these technologies. There's a broader skills point than, you know, the obvious one of we just don't have enough specialists and technical players. Inside business, people don't understand this very well. And you can see that in the kind of industries that lag behind in adoption. The second area I would highlight is data. Again, it's been referenced here, but as much as 80% of an AI project can actually be spent trying to sort out the data that you're going to use in order to have a successful implementation. And for some organizations, particularly SMEs, that just makes it impossible to do. And speaking as an SME CEO myself, moving to new systems and dealing with your data legacy, even in a small company, can be the most expensive and the most unsatisfactory part of the process. So now, actually, funnily enough, AI can help with that. And one of the things we look forward to is easier to use tools that actually will sort data. And that, I think that's a direction that we should all welcome and embrace. But the other thing I would highlight as well is, and this is perhaps what you were alluding to, Alistair, is the role of confidence and trust here. And we at Tech UK see trust across everything our industry does as being the most important point, and the ethical approach to things is not just about legislation, regulation, although there's going to be plenty of that needed and probably more than enough provided. But, you know, do people trust this? We've had a survey recently in the UK saying that only 35% of people surveyed would actually trust a company that's using AI in significant processes as much as they would a company that wasn't. And there's plenty of stories going around. There's one about a problem here in the UK with accounting systems in the post office where it wasn't actually an AI implementation, but it gets connected and all these things build up. I've long said that, you know, it would have been nice if we'd managed to make this not artificial intelligence, which has so many connotations and value judgments involved in it. And we didn't talk so much about robotic process, again, which brings with it all sorts of connotations. I wanted us to call it augmented intelligence. However, you know, that's not happened, and we are with what we've got. So I think building on trust is important, and also our industry maybe has been guilty of overselling. You know, there's a hype curve on everything, isn't there? And so, you know, you can see really strong usage of AI. I'm sure we're going to come on to those, but you can also see where, you know, we've actually said this thing can do more than it actually can. Who hasn't been driven mad by, you know, chatbots of various flavors who actually aren't supported properly in the business process, aren't supported by that human interaction, and tend to undermine people's faith in, you know, can I actually interact with a computer in a sensible way?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. Let me just maybe throw out a few questions to anybody who'd like to answer based on your responses to this first question. And one would be about the particular uncertainty around the return on investment in AI as compared with previous generations of digital technology, which in a way were about reducing uncertainty. That's one thing. And a second question I'd like to ask is about the skills issue, going back to skills, because I am told that if you look on the sort of the AI Reddit pages from young employees, recent graduates, one of the comments that comes out frequently is that they've been hired to do jobs where the employer didn't really know what skills they needed in AI, that AI was a sort of umbrella term covering many types of skill, and that some employers just don't know what they don't know. And so, yeah, any thoughts around these, please?
May I?
Please, Benoit.
Yeah, great follow-up questions. To maybe bounce on what was said about trust, what Julian said about trust. I think it's an absolute key issue, and it's not at all related to only AI. And I also agree with Julian that AI is a terrible term. So internally at MetaLab, when we talk about these issues of trust, we don't talk about AI, we talk about trust in automated data-based decision-making systems. And we realize that there's a need, and we've engaged a program with a major industry partner, which is not official yet, to study from a scientific research angle what are the factors driving trust in automated decision-making systems. because that's going to impact not just the users and the adoption by citizens or by the employees or by the customers, but it's also going to impact in our intuition the relationship, the rapport of leadership towards AI, especially in smaller and medium-sized businesses, where the framework for thinking is different. So these people, before they engage into what they see as a risky project, because there's already a lot of proof of concept projects that have failed, they need to trust that they can succeed with AI, and which leads me to the second part of the comment I wanted to bring to the table about your questions, is that it's we are in a still very immature domain. And the reason it's different from IT projects, probably some of you remember the first web projects were questioned the exact same way. Why do I need to get on the web? I have all my customer interaction just fine. So here we're taking a new technology and we're trying to convince people that they will improve their business with it. It's normal that they don't have confidence. So I think the task is upon us, the practitioners and the thinkers of AI, to really focus on how can we support success stories of using AI by vertical, by sector, which can inspire other companies to do the same. The smaller the companies are, the more they need to be reassured, the more they tend to pack together on these topics. And so I think it's absolutely key. Last, all that, when you put it in perspective with the skill question you asked, it's obvious that the leadership very often, unless they went, as a few I know, unless they went to they took the Stanford course on AI or things like that, they have no idea. They just see that as another technology. They think by hiring a young graduate with 2 years experience, they're going to have someone able to implement AI. They don't understand the depth of the change and the transformation. And I will end by opening up to a consideration, which is very often applying AI to your core business processes requires leadership to be ready to understand their business in a new way. I remember a company that has implemented AI to solve practical operation problems, and at the end of the process realized that they could start a totally new nature for their business. They could shift from a simple infrastructure operator to a pure software turnkey solution vendor, which much higher potential. So that is scary to a lot of leaders. They don't want to go there, right?
Thank you very much. They're very rich. Cecilia, I see you have your hand up, please.
Yes, thank you. So I'm trying to give some perspective from the company point of view. And I think that what probably Julian and I share is that we represent a lot of companies, many of them very small. And in my world, there's a lot of talk about productivity, efficiency, also sustainability in the manufacturing sector. And to achieve that, start off with being more productive. I don't know, many countries in Europe at least, there's not only a lack of AI talent, there's a lack of people, full stop. So it's not easy to staff a manufacturing company at all today. So what I see many companies striving towards, which is a real daily challenge, is to create a part of the day, if you want, autonomous production. You want to have the machines, the production system, self-autonomous assembly, if you like, as part of the 24 hours you have in front of you to manufacture something. And to achieve greater autonomy, you need AI, of course, of some sort. So this is the challenge, is increased autonomy, to have less staff because there are not a lot of people around. AI is a big enabler in that sense. AI is also a very big enabler in looking at the value chains and the transparency to really acknowledge where parts are coming from when they're supposed to be delivered, the logistics chain and beyond, to have this transparency that companies today are required to have. And then there's production optimization because you have today, and I think that Julian recognizes this very well, you have a very low volume, high mix situation in most manufacturing companies. And to achieve this, you need to increase autonomy, which is difficult, and you need to have a very smart AI to be able to enable this type of productivity. Swedish industry in manufacturing is completely today customized manufacturing. It's very, very little high volume products going on at all. And I see AI as crucial. And there is not a lot of public support for this in Sweden at the moment, at least. Some which is ongoing, I'll talk about that later on. But those are some of the challenges where AI is really crucial.
Thank you, Cecilia. Julian, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks very much. And as building on comments from Cecilia and also from Benoit, and I think one of the challenges in terms of, I completely agree with both, particularly Benoit's point about the top of the shop in most businesses don't understand AI. You can make a case that really at board level, do they really actually understand the business impact of digital technologies? You only got to look at the challenge of cybersecurity. Do boards really understand that? Of course, AI is only going to make that even more complicated. But the point I would really like to make is on the ROI point you made. If you adopt only a cost reduction approach to the use of automated technologies, new technologies, then you really do run the risk of actually making things worse, because we've all seen this over time. Businesses have taken a service and they said, that's too expensive to do like this, let's do it another way. Used to be outsourcing, offshoring. Increasingly people say, well, let's use the AI and the computer to do this. And actually, if at the end you offer a worse service because you don't actually have the customer at the forefront of what you're trying to do, then of course you're not going to get a good return on investment, because what happens, people will not want to use these things if it's a worse service than they were getting before. So I think that's the ROI needs to be looked at differently. And I also think that the other point that follows through is understanding your business and the technology well enough to actually know where the bang for the buck is. I remember visiting a Chinese car manufacturer some time ago, and everybody was focused on the AI in the car, in the actual vehicle, and talking about all the automation. It was at the top of the hype of self-driving and all the other things that were arriving. And the person running the company said, no, actually where we're getting the best benefit from AI is in the supply chain. It's actually in managing all of the components, all of the suppliers, all of the things that we need to do in order to produce a vehicle. And actually this sort of shiny, new tech gizmo interface stuff is nice to have compared to making a very good vehicle.
Thank you, Julian. Pekka, I wonder if you'd like to chime in on this one, or maybe I'll go to the next question.
Few reflections probably on the uncertainty part, Alistair, you mentioned. This AI and the aspects of AI is it is new, and there are multiple facets which are unknown, and therefore there will be mistakes. It's part of any learning process that we do make mistakes, and we need to accept those mistakes and kind of wrap it around to the way how we learn that mistakes will happen, and we need to extract the most out of that in order to be in a better position, not to stop the investment rather than finding the even better avenues where the learning part of the investment should be then directed. And AI is never 100% right. It is probabilities. It's better in understanding the patterns and probabilities in many cases that it does it faster and it does it better, but it's never 100% sure. So therefore, the whole concept that there is mistake, but those can be rectified, should be rectified, readdressed, should be part of the way how we approach the AI. So I would probably only state again that in my mind, this is investment also in learning. So this, if we don't start today, we will not be where we need to be 10 years down the road as companies, as countries, and as a EU, as an economical entity. And if we look China today, China is the only digital country which can really derive a number of benefits being connected. We don't agree with the ethics, a number of other things, but if we look how they have been faster in learning and faster in creating these connected systems and the connected world and using the data, that tells that if we don't embark on this learning journey, then we will be in difficulties.
Thank you very much, Pekka. Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. I'll ask two questions perhaps. One is the question that's come in from the audience, and that's how would you evaluate the readiness of firms for AI? Are there any sort of metrics you'd like to propose? That's one question from the audience. And let me ask maybe a little bit of a more provocative question, and that's to do with regulations and high-level principles around AI. So a sort of leitmotif of the many principles which exist is human-centric or ethical AI. What do you think this means in the context of manufacturing ethical AI? It's difficult to think of the ethical dimension of an AI which is used for quality control, for example. So again, I would it was the role of the orientation of some regulators trying to implement the concept of ethical AI, and then the other question was how do you evaluate the readiness of firms for AI? Please let me invite anybody who'd like to take that up.
I could go, Alistair, if you
please, Pekka,
if you allow. On the ethical side, I think that the regulation and regulators, and they are doing so, but they need to be very wary of the context. So the consumer application where there's a lot of information, personal information, vis-a-vis closed system industrial AI solution for process improvement they are completely different contexts. And therefore, I support and I think that there's a strong support to approach the ethical side based on the risk. So the relativity of risk, the propensity for the risk to materialize, and then the consequences of the risk. And therefore, the ethicality or ethical side is probably easier to understand when you portray that against the risk dimension. And the regulator and what is happening now in the EU has approached the risk-based approach for regulation. And then the key question is how the high risk and low risk applications are defined and determined, and then what are the needed elements to make sure that these systems would then comply to the level of potential risk which may come if the system doesn't work. On the readiness side, there are, for that question, there are a number of textbooks or online surveys. In Finland, there is a readiness matrix. Companies can test their current standing. So, and that's not the only one. There are a number of other similar tests where you can self-assess your readiness and then also derive actions which could help you to progress on your own path.
Thank you, Pekka. Julian.
Thank you. Yeah, let me deal with the ethical. Ethics has to be at the forefront of everything that you use automation for, from who does the design of the systems, which, you know, if you don't have diversity of design and development, then you build in so many potentials to just augment, exaggerate, or increase the unfairness of systems and unfairness of things, and that's there's even before computers. Just think about how seatbelts were tested. Who were they tested on? They were tested on dummies made in the shape of men. So did they work very well for different types of people, smaller people, women? No. So you have to think about that kind of thing. You also have to think about the ethics of, okay, we've made this thing very complicated, which is good because the computer is helping to do it. But have we actually given enough thought to who's going to use it? And do they know how to use it effectively? And we've all seen the challenges with that. The most extreme example being possibly in aircraft, where if the system is too complicated for the human operators, the interface to the human operators isn't easy to understand. You can have disastrous consequences. So I think, if the more you automate, you've really got to always have ethics right at the start and the forefront of what you're doing. And that comes back to my point earlier about why are you doing this? If it's just to reduce cost, then you're probably going to get something wrong somewhere. In terms of regulation, I mean, Pekka has summed this up, and you wrote an outstanding piece of work on the guidelines, you and colleagues earlier, Pekka, which is a very, anybody who hasn't seen that should really look that through. But I think one of the biggest things I would draw attention to is equality of access, particularly equality of access to data, because so much of what happens in AI depends on data. So who's controlling the data and who has actually got access to that to bring solutions to the party? That's particularly true where you've got innovators and smaller companies trying to use this stuff. Can they get the data that they need? And it's also true when you think about what happens to the data that's gathered, often incidentally, through automation. People don't set out to gather this data. It just sort of comes along with the thing that they're doing. What are you doing with that data? How are you making that accessible to people? And what are the guidelines that you're going to respect there? And for governments, it's very much about, making sure there's an open level playing field for people. And there are, I mean, you referenced this as well, Cecilia, was and Pekka made this as well, the adoption of AI around the world. Europe has lagged behind because it hasn't addressed the kind of concerns as well as the kind of infrastructure and the kind of provision of data that other countries are actually leading on.
I'll invite Cecilia, but let me just first throw out another question, which perhaps in the next round, anybody, and Cecilia as well, is free to muse on. And that's with respect to data and equal access to data, in the context of manufacturing, what sort of data issues arise that might have policy implications as regards data use across supply chains? So I can understand that, of course, there's always potential problems in giving away commercially sensitive information, but I'd welcome your expert views on that as well. But Cecilia, I think you had some observations on my previous question.
Yes, thank you. I'm sort of steering towards the manufacturing sectors because that's kind of where I'm a bit sitting a lot of the time. And I want to sort of bring forward the German Industry 4.0 program because it's been sort of the template for many other countries' actions on this in this area. And there's an excellent digital maturity index work that has been done, and it's used by a lot of countries. We use it in Sweden in the program that I head myself called Production 2030. And it's very much geared towards the SMEs, the Mittelstand of manufacturing. And it gives companies a focus. First you measure, then you can prioritize. And we're talking about quite a low margin industry because manufacturing is the title of this hour we're spending together. These companies, especially the sub-suppliers, they don't have big margins, so they really need to focus. So that's a great tool, and I would say you can stay quite clear of a lot of ethics because there's a lot of machine data. Another set of data that I know has been very popular to use to train AI, also in industry, is all data connected to carbon emission, because data connected to carbon emission is public, and you can use this to run big data sets. That's just an outliner. The next comment around supply chains and policy actions that you stated, your last question, Alistair. I'd just like to point to the project Gaia X now building up across Europe, which is a big standardized framework for networks, I would say data platforms for suppliers to be connected in the same sort of value chains, which is the aim of this Gaia X is to have standards. This is where policy comes in. The function of these networks is to have supply chains connected and to thereby increase sustainability and transparency. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of AI algorithms to get all of these fields of data connected in the right way. But this is an interesting project, and I don't know what's going on in the US and Asia when it comes to these platforms. There are for sure a lot around, but are they as large in framework as the GaiaX project?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecilia. Benoit, I wondered if you wanted to comment on what's just been said, but also maybe I'll go back to a point that you raised at the start about the possible roles of public financing here. Again, which is something not often discussed in connection with AI diffusion in manufacturing, but perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on what you were referring to.
Yep, absolutely. First, I'd like to just maybe make a few additional comments of what's been said regarding ethics of AI in manufacturing. And as often in the conversation, there's a lot of focus on bias and privacy. So it's all about the data. And that's absolutely right. That's probably the main source of ethical concerns. But there's another one that is not addressed, I think, enough. It's using these systems. And Pekka touched it, I think, when he mentioned the risk level. Risk is not just about the data. Risk is also about what the outcome of this processing is going to be. Let me give you just a quick example. I think everybody will understand. It's not in manufacturing precisely, it's in construction. There was a solution that my team built using cameras on top of a crane to look at where people were on the construction site and deduct from that, predict delays, because data scientists had established that there was a connection between where the workers were positioning themselves and what was happening or expected to happen on the construction site. And that by detecting unusual patterns, they could, on a repetitive, because a lot of things are repetitive on the construction site, they could alert the manager before the employees do it, because they usually wait until the truck isn't there, and 15 minutes later the truck still isn't there, and then they talk to the manager. Well, this way they could know ahead of time. So it was a very ethical solution, but it's been rejected by fear that this system could one day be put in the hands of people who would monitor employees in terms of, you know, are they going to smoke a cigarette in the back, etc. So sometimes ethics and trust, which are very linked, are hiding in places that are not clearly about the data. So that's the first comment I wanted to make. About financing, I'm going to link that answer, public financing, to that question you're asking, to the first question you asked in this set, which is, are there frameworks for establishing data readiness? There was a very interesting initiative in France, led by the French investment bank, BPI France, supported by Hub, the French AI Hub, which is an industry association I've co-founded, where we devised a methodology. It's really consulting. It's very hard to self-assess, but a short 2 weeks consulting job, looking at a 360 degree of any company, interviewing quite a few people with very, clear angles of questioning, to build out a map of what's missing in terms of readiness, but also identifying the first project, because you're not ready until you're ready to implement a first project and have a roadmap for more. So that program is called the DIAG AI Data, the DIAG Data AI. It's operated by PPI France. There's about, I think, these days 50 experts that have been certified for that. And what's the link between that and public financing? Well, this program is subsidized by the French government through the French Investment Bank. So when a small company is wondering whether they should do AI, a certified consultant comes on board, and half of the cost of that consultant is paid for by the government. That is, I think, the right type of help. Of course, this is small scale. This is just to put a foot in the on the first step of the long path towards successful AI implementation, but it's the first step. I think in general, maybe due to the complexity of the job at hand, regulators, whether they are national or large, tend to focus on macro measures. And I think they're hitting the devil, which hides in the details, right? For instance, a lot of subsidies are structured to feed industries from the top, with the assumption that there's going to be some kind of a trickle-down effect on the value chain of a given large corporate, especially in manufacturing, aeronautics, energy, etc. My analysis of that is that when you look at the economy, the number of actual companies that make up, that are part of one such value chain is very small. And so when you do that, you leave out a whole bunch of companies that are left with no real access to capital, or that are left with very generic public financing that applies not just to themselves in manufacturing, but to someone in transportation, someone in services, and so it's really not adapted. So what I'm advocating for is much more granularity. Remove the farsight glasses and take your reading glasses if you're going to regulate that in terms, not regulate, but if you want to have an effective policy to sustain innovation for this hidden mass. I often compare that to the black matter in the universe. It's there, but you don't see it. There's a kind of black matter hiding in the economy, and that we need to address.
Thanks very much. Interesting analogy with physics and with optics as well. Thank you. Let me go then. We have another 8 minutes. So I'd like to ask a question about, two related questions about policy. And maybe I'll begin with you, Julian. And the questions are, so many governments have created institutions that aim to accelerate the uptake of digital technologies in firms. Famous, applied research center like Fraunhofer, or the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program in the United States, or innovation vouchers in many countries. From your experience, do you think that such institutions need to perhaps retailer some of what they do? That they need to develop AI-specific measures or AI-specific programs? That's one part of the question on policy. And related to that is, what do you think should be the policy priorities that governments should be developing to expedite the uptake of AI in manufacturing? So perhaps go with you, Julian, first.
Yeah, and I'll be very interested to hear Cecilia's take on this, but I do think that having a focus on the application of AI into the various areas of manufacturing and exemplars and somewhere to try things. One of the things that was done in the financial services industry, and the financial services industry is way more advanced in its uptake of various types of AI than manufacturing is to date. was helped along its way by a sandbox that was set up by the regulator. There isn't an exact equivalent of that, but essentially what it did was it attracted companies to try things, and it allowed them to actually put that into the context of how the industry was organized. And I think, you know, you can see that, and we have the catapults in the UK, you've talked about Fraunhofer, there are other institutes. I think those institutes are a really good thing, but they should be challenged, I think, to you know, really provide a space there. And part of that will be providing data and actually understanding, Cecilia, as I said, I'd be very interested in your take on this, but understanding what is data and use of data and availability of data that's going to help everybody versus, you know, what are the things that are a competitive edge in this space. It'd be very interesting to see how that would play out in manufacturing. But the biggest thing that I think governments can do is to find a way to set challenges that then private sector and industry can address. So if you take something like net zero, you know, it's clear that so much of this, for example, understanding the carbon footprint of the whole supply chain, can only be done with automated technologies, with AI. And so setting a target on that and reporting. Everybody's going to have to publish stuff, but we published stuff on emissions before in the car industry, and you know, look what happened. It wasn't correct. So I think setting challenges like that, you know, we've seen, for example, in health industry, that, you know, setting a challenge on finding solutions to the pandemic problems and other challenges in health produced a fantastic implementation of new technologies. So there is that, and then the last thing, of course, is the skills. You know, how do you actually close the skills gap, both in experts but also in practitioners?
Thank you, Julian. Let me hand to Cecilia. So Cecilia, if you could just take maybe a minute and a half, just because we're running close to time.
I see that.
Then I'll ask Pekka to close.
Absolutely. On the carbon footprint point, just this has been raised several times by our manufacturing industry, and there's no standardized way to illustrate the carbon footprint you make. So AI is probably welcome there, and we're not there yet. We've talked about sandboxes in Sweden to have the government support available sandboxes for industrial data. We're not there yet. There's no investments done as of yet from the Swedish government, for example. I mean, then there's the complexity of AI, first of all, having to be generic, where you have the skills, you have the top management and the board, members of boards to really understand the generics of AI, but to create value for the customer, which is the manufacturing company's dilemma, you need to be very, very specific. And that's where the difficulties lie in the data sets which we talked about. I can only sort of quote and see what the Swedish actors are doing. We have the Wallenberg family, which is well-known industrial family in Sweden, investing roughly, I would say, close to €1 billion in AI, both on the fundamental research side and on the in the broader sense as well. And they have a company conglomerate called Combient, where they gather all their share, where they have shares in one group and try to deploy AI as much as they can. And this is going very, very slowly. And the slowness of this process is because the lack of data, the lack of training, lack of talent, and so on and so forth. So policy can only go the same speed of deployment, so to speak. That's kind of my view on the whole thing. We'll get there eventually, but it's not going to go fast.
Thank you very much. Pekka, could I ask you just to take 1 minute, literally, and then we'll close?
Not that much to add. Probably two perspectives. One perspective is that when we look the public-private partnerships, we would do a great favor in taking a very progressive stand on innovation side, more progressive than we have done so far. So really investing in innovation, not incremental, but radical innovation in relation to AI, to digital infrastructure of future, edge computing, and data. And that would then create the waves, which would provide a lot of benefits for everyone. And then the second perspective, we so often, when we think about the competitiveness, we think about the competitiveness of a company. But actually, why wouldn't we think the competitiveness of ecosystems? Because ecosystems are the entities which actually are fighting, and that means that then there are small ones, big ones, there are suppliers, there are startups, R&D elements, and there's also public funding. So European ecosystems, what are the enabling elements in building their competitiveness based on the technologies, including the AI? That would be the element for innovation policy and the thinking I would suggest, in addition what has been said already.
Yeah, Pekka, thank you so much. And this was such a rich session, such a group of highly qualified experts that I feel that we could go on with this conversation for another hour. And actually, I have a whole store of other questions I would have liked to put. But Benoit, Cecilia, Julian, and Pekka, thank you very much. And thank you, audience, for tuning in. And I hope you enjoy the next session as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.